In this week's video, I'll be showing you how I throw, glaze and fire my simple stoneware inkwells that do come with an accompanying hand-thrown ink dip pen, but I'll save the making of that for an upcoming video. Let's begin. These forms are thrown from 200 grams of clay each. I'd be lying if I said I found these things easy to throw. Sometimes they are, and other times they just don't do what I want. I think a lot of that has to do with clay distribution, but I'll talk more about that later. The first step is always centering the clay, which is when I force the stoneware to be as central on the wheel head as possible, with no wobbles or undulations. I then push firmly down into the middle, but not all the way through to the metal wheel head. I then open up the base, which I try to leave about 4 or 5 millimeters thick, and then I spend a moment compressing it with the edge of my thumb. The clay is then pinched between a knuckle on the outside and the pads of my fingers on the inside, and is gently drawn up. This process is called pulling up the clay. I try to get this basic cylinder to the height of my throwing gauge's pointer in about 2 or 3 pulls. You don't want to overwork the clay, nor do you want to overthrow it, which is when you throw the walls too thin and the piece simply collapses as the clay has become wet and saturated with water. Once I'm happy with the rough shape, which can take a few moments to get absolutely correct, I'll do some initial tidying just to strengthen the walls for the rather dramatic folding of clay that'll happen on the top. I scrape away the excess around the base, remove the water from inside, which is important because these are such enclosed vessels that if I forget to remove it, it can be almost impossible to get rid of it thereafter, and the pot's base will become soggy and weak as these are left overnight. Let's take a moment to talk about how the clay is distributed at this stage. This is a cross-section of the vessel, and as you can see, I try to leave the upper walls of the pot thicker rather than thinner, like this, as I'll be folding the top inward to form the shoulder of the inkwell and the rim. If it were this thin, I'd have far too little material to work with, and the chances of things going wrong are far greater. It would flop inward, or you simply might not have enough clay to throw a substantial rim. So I try to leave it thicker, like this. That way I have enough material to work with, and the walls will have enough strength to withstand being folded over. And this is how I do that. I wet the upper sections of the walls and gently collar the clay inward. I don't try to do it all in one go, instead I do it bit by bit. Once roughly collared in, I can throw that section inward, keeping one finger beneath the area I'm working to support the overhanging walls. And as I work, I try to make sure that the rim section of the pot doesn't get too thin. Then, to form the rim, I dig in the fingertip of my middle finger, and with these, I know that ultimately the opening needs to fit the ink dip pen, and to measure that, I simply make sure that it's the width of my index finger plus about 2 or 3 millimeters. Then, if any corrections need to be done to the shape, I insert my little finger inside and throw against it. And finally, once I'm happy with the basic form, I use the straight, sharp edge of a metal kidney to push into the clay, smoothing it and straightening it, and perhaps most importantly, removing all that excess wet slip you can see that was covering the surface. This will make lifting it away from the wheel much easier, and it also means the piece will dry out more quickly. I then do some delicate finishing on the rim just to further define the shape and to make it sharper. I then take my chamois leather and very carefully drape it over the rim. This neatens the clay there and helps level off the rim. Now the inkwell is ready to be removed from the wheel, and I do this by sliding a twisted wire underneath the form. I then scrape my hands dry, gently clasp them around the pot and apply most of the pressure around the base where it's strongest, and then gently lift it away, making sure that as I move it, both my hands stay completely still and level. and now that I've thrown a board's worth, I'll set these aside to slowly dry out to a condition we call leather hard. At this stage, the pots can be picked up and handled without them simply deforming, which they would do if you try to handle them immediately after throwing them. The plastic wrapped around them was there to make sure that they didn't dry out too much, as if the pots do become too dry, they can reach a point where they become unworkable. So generally, you'll find that potters are very good at keeping an eye on lots of different things, as monitoring the dryness of the work is vital. To trim these, I brush some slip around the base, which acts as glue, almost. I then take the pot and rub it against the metal wheel head, which causes the slip to dry very quickly, thus sticking it firmly in place. I also squash down this tiny portion of clay, just to create a strong seal around the base, which will hopefully prevent it from coming off as I trim. I then turn away clay from the outer walls and refine the shape of the inkwell. This also makes the pot lighter. Typically, you don't want to pick a pot up and immediately feel that it's heavy or that it surprises your expectations by being heavier than you imagined. I then take a much smaller turning tool and carefully trim around the rim of the pot. I want to make the angle where the shoulder of the pot meets the rim to be as sharp as possible, as my glazes will react more dramatically over them. I then remove the inkwell from the wheel head by sliding underneath the sharp edge of this metal knife. Now, trimming the sides and top of these is easy, but turning the base does provide some extra challenges. So to help finish these, I have a specially made chuck, which stays wrapped up in plastic to keep it leather hard, which I like as it tends to stick to the clay of the pot better than say a bisque fired chuck or a bone dry chuck. Anyhow, I've specially turned this so that this inward sloping angle accommodates the shoulder of the inkwell, and the hollow in the middle provides a space for the rim to go in without being damaged. Then, to keep everything held down securely as I'm working, I place a spinner on top. This one was made for me by Richard Carter. I'll leave a link in the bio to them. I push down through this and it distributes the weight and prevents the base from bowing, potentially, if I were to just use my fingers. I've had this chuck now for a surprisingly long time, probably more than a year at this point. It isn't perfect, but it works and it's very solid. So to begin, I centre it on the wheel head and then secure it in place with 3 soft lumps of clay. The first is just a little illustration that might more clearly explain the chuck to you. The bonus of keeping them leather hard, too, is that you can trim them if the shape is wrong, to fit the shape of your pot, although obviously you don't want to do that too much. I push the clay at 3 points around the chuck, as if they were the points of a triangle. Then I carefully push 3 more lumps of clay around the inkwell in this groove at the top. As I push these in, I need to be very careful that they don't move the position of the centered inkwell on top. I then put the spinner on and tap center it. And thankfully, for these forms, the spinner helps to provide a sort of template, so I know exactly where to turn to. The spinner is then plucked away so that I can trim away the wiring off marks that are left from when the piece is sliced off the wheel head. The bases of pots are just as important as any other part of the vessel, and often these parts can tell you a lot about the maker. I then take a metal kidney and burnish the clay on the beveled edge and the base. This compresses the grains of sand that have been exposed through trimming back into the clay body, and it means the pot will have a nicer finish once finally glaze fired. I then take my maker's mark and push it into the clay, being careful, as it is very easy to push it all the way through and to make a hole. Believe me, I've done it. And that's the piece finished for now. There's still an awful lot left to do though. I thought this might be interesting to include. This is a cross-section of an inkwell that sadly didn't make it, but it's a good example of a pot that's been very evenly thrown and trimmed, and I still recommend beginners to cut their pots in half quite regularly, as it really does provide so much information. How well the clay is distributed if there are any thick or thin spots. In this instance, this pot was cut in half because the corners of the base were too thin, so the whole bottom literally slumped inward as I was turning. I then returned my tungsten carbide tools to their little padded box, as the blades are really brittle and all it would take is one bad fall for them to shatter. I'll then leave these inkwells for a couple of days until they turn completely bone dry. This is how I keep my chuck nice and leather hard for future use. After every session, I dunk it in water and then wrap it tightly in plastic. I then place this, along with my other chucks, in an airtight box. Once the pots are completely bone dry, meaning that there's no moisture left inside the clay body, I pack them into my electric kiln to be biscuit fired. I do this overnight, and the firing program goes slowly up to 1000 degrees Celsius, which changes the material into one that's much harder and stronger, and also one that's slightly absorbent, which it needs to be for the glazing process. Once the kiln is fully packed, I close the lid and switch it on so that it fires overnight when the electricity rates are cheaper. Once fired, the kiln takes about 24 hours to cool down. Then it can be unpacked and the inkwells can be waxed. This is tricky due to how narrow the opening is, but each is carefully balanced and then a layer of wax emulsion is brushed over the bottom, my left hand constantly at the ready to catch it in case it flies away. The extra dab you see me doing is just to fill up my maker's mark, as if glaze does get into that little detailed space. It can be tricky to clean. The porous clay body quickly draws out the moisture in the brush, so you have to work fast doing this, otherwise it'll catch and pull the whole inkwell off centre. But essentially, this is just like a wax resist. It prevents a layer of glaze from adhering to the base of the pot, which is important as the pots are fired directly on the kiln shelf, and if the base has glaze on it, it'll stick the pot to the shelf, which could in turn damage either the inkwell or the kiln shelf itself. So making sure that the bases are totally void of any glaze is a really important step. Once waxed, these can be glazed. I grasp them with a pair of tongs and submerge them into a liquid which is laden with all kinds of different raw materials. The water is absorbed into the porous clay body, leaving a layer of these mixed raw materials on the outside of the form. I then set the inkwell aside. These pots can be troublesome to glaze properly all at once. Once they're dipped into the bucket of glaze, I let the liquid bubble inside. Occasionally, if there's a bare patch which I didn't get, I'll patch it up later on. But usually this gets everything and leaves a layer of glaze on the outside of the pot, which is about 2 to 3 millimeters thick. As the clay body is now saturated with water, I'll leave these pots for a couple of days to totally dry out before attempting to clean off the outside surface. As the moisture leaves them, the surfaces become far more powdery and easier to tidy up, although at the same time the surface becomes very fragile. All it takes is one wrong move to chip or damage the glazed surface. So I work carefully, rubbing away any stray drips of glaze whilst working over a basin of water which catches the excess dust, and eventually I can recycle this glaze back into my larger buckets, sieving it in to catch any larger pieces of debris. Once the surface of the glaze is smooth and clean, I can begin to tidy up the base. Even though it was waxed, some glaze does settle onto it, so I tidy it up with a damp sponge, removing all of the glaze and ensuring that the line where clay meets glaze around the beveled edge is as clean and neat as possible. This particular glaze doesn't move very much during the firing, so the more neatly it's finished at this stage, the better it'll look once glaze fired. I could then load the gas kiln up with pots, which includes the inkwell, somewhere in there, which is then lit and then fired up in a reduction atmosphere over about a 9-hour period. I've made another video that goes over this firing process in far greater detail, so I'll leave a link to that on screen now, or you can find a link in the description below. Once the kiln has fired, and after it's cooled down, which takes about 30 hours, it can be unpacked. The pots are now shrouded in a layer of thick glass with a clay body as hard as stone. And here's the before and after for this white glaze, although truthfully speaking, it's more of a grey. The process of reduction firing brings out all those iron speckles that cover the surface of the pot, and they also shrink quite a lot during this process. Nonetheless, once finished, I match them with an appropriate ink dip pen and find a cork that fits it nicely. I've been making quite a lot of these recently, and I hope to include about a dozen sets in my next online shop update, which, with any luck, will be happening quite soon. And for all of those who have asked, I will be making a full video that shows how I throw, trim, glaze, and fire these ink dip pens. They might just be one of the most difficult things I make, but the end result, this set, is so worth all the effort. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.